Today on The State of Us, the battle for Scaffle voters in 2024, and could a third party work? To understand the 24 race, remember the Scaffle voter. If Ronald Reagan were to come back to life, he would probably be confused by the leftist tone that the early 2024 Republican presidential campaign has sometimes taken. That's what we're going to look at today, a piece buried inside the New York Times Sunday edition, as well as a piece from the Wall Street Journal about the potential of a third party. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson.
Unfortunately, it's never too early to look at the next presidential election. We're already starting to get people throwing their proverbial hat into the ring. And so this piece takes a little bit of different look at voters, not just liberal or conservative, but it breaks it down into a graph. And I remember the government teacher at the high school where I taught had students take this test, and it breaks you down into one of four quadrants based on social issues and your financial, not issue, but your outlook, the way you look at finances. So It's kind of an interesting, different take, but the author uses it now to bring up some interesting voting patterns, or what could become some interesting voting patterns. And, if you're a lover of history and presidential elections, you know how third-party candidates can affect the political outcome of a presidential election, as well as the fact that no third-party candidate has ever won the presidential election.
So what's going on? Because, as obviously Ron DeSantis has kind of been assumed as the major contender, he's started to have more events. Trump is having more events. So Mr. Trump's trouncing of the Republican establishment in 2016 and his continued popularity among the party's voters has exposed a weakness of the laissez-faire economic approach known as Reaganism. Namely, it isn't especially popular with most voters, including many Republicans. With Mr. DeSantis announcing his candidacy Wednesday night, we have to highlight the possibility that the most important fact about the U.S. politics is this: Americans tend to be more progressive on economic issues than they are on social issues. If you can remember that, you'll be able to make a better sense of the 2024 campaign. And that's basically the foundation of this article, or what David Leonhardt is contending for us in this piece. So as we look at the data, right, this chart that Lance was referencing, basically it's divided into four quadrants. So from top to bottom, you have more socially conservative, and then on the bottom, more socially liberal. And then from left to right, you have more fiscally liberal, and on the right, you have more fiscally conservative. So one of these kind of age-old notions, right, is that some affluent voters like to describe themselves as socially liberal and fiscally conservative. That'd be the bottom right quadrant of this graph that we're looking at.
Which is where I've always scored when I took these so-called tests online.
Yeah.
And you can look them up and you can take them. They just ask you a series of questions. If this were to happen, would you either do this or this? If you had this amount of money, would you do this or this with it? And, it takes 20, 30 minutes to take the test, and then it gives you a score. And what does David's chart tell us? That those of us like myself who feel we're socially liberal and fiscally conservative, how do we fit in with everybody else?
Well, it happens to be the least common combination in American politics.
There you go.
In fact, to some
You're
people's
friendly
surprise,
redneck liberal, right? I mean, I don't fit in with anybody.
Well, because I think that, like, even when you and I think about, or maybe even a lot of our listeners, when we think about who is a swing voter, that description is probably something that kind of comes to mind. Well, people that are more socially liberal and more fiscally conservative, that's kind of a swing voter. But in reality, it's actually the opposite of that group.
And that's the point of the article, is that group,
the swing voter.
The group that I make up, nobody's should be paying attention to me. Who they should be paying attention to is whom?
The Scaffle voter. And the Scaffle voter is more socially conservative and more fiscally liberal.
Okay, so what's that mean? I mean,
good question.
What does it mean to be socially conservative but fiscally liberal?
These Scaffles have voted for progressive economic policies when they appear as ballot initiatives, even in red states. Arkansas, Florida, Missouri, and Nebraska, for instance, have passed minimum wage increases. Idaho, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Utah have expanded Medicaid through Obamacare. Republicans without a college degree are often the ones who break with their party on these ballot initiatives. At the same time, Scaffles are the reason that a Times poll last year showed that most voters, including many Latinos, prefer the Republican Party's stance on illegal immigration to the Democratic Party. Or consider a recent Washington Post poll on transgender issues in which most Americans said they opposed puberty-blocking treatments for children. Yes, public opinion has nuances. Most Americans also support laws prohibiting discrimination against trans people. Sometimes the parties can also overreach. When Democrats talk positively about socialism, they alienate swing voters. On abortion, Republicans have gone so far right, passing almost total bans, that the issue has become a drag on the party. But don't confuse the nuances and the exceptions with the big picture. Mr. DeSantis and Mr. Trump understand that the old Republican approach to economic policy is a vulnerability, which is why they often sound like populists.
I'm feeling especially feisty this morning, so I'm just going to say it. I said this in our production meeting. These are the people who, it sounds like to me, want everybody to believe like them. They want, all these social nuances to go away and say, well, let's just do this. But I want the government to take care of me. That's fiscally liberal. I want to be taken care of, but I want everybody to think like me and behave like me, but I can't take care of myself. So I want more government programs that help the people like me.
I mean, I think that, I guess put it this way, I think that sums up the end result of what a lot of people think, but I'm not sure that a lot of people would say that that's how they feel.
Right. They would.
You know what I mean?
Oh, I'm sure there are people right now just screaming.
That's not what I want.
At their computers or at their radios, depending on how they're listening to the show. But that's basically, folks, what you're saying. You're saying, I don't want any changes in our society. I like it the way it is. I don't want immigrants here. I'm really kind of, I'm strong on this, anti-abortion stance. Everybody needs to go to a Christian church because that's what makes me feel comfortable. But daggone it, I need more money from Social Security. I need the government to pay more of my hospital bills because I just can't make ends meet. I've talked to a number of these socially conservative people because we live in that kind of community. And I taught their children and I spoke to them and they were totally against government handouts. But then you start saying, well, is your dad paid for land that he doesn't plant by the government? Well, yeah. Well, does your grandma get Social Security? Well, yeah. Well, then you have socialist leanings. No, socialism's horrible. Oh, it's horrible. Yeah, we got to cut this, this, and this. Oh, but that's because your family doesn't get any of those things. The social programs that your family participates in, you want us to keep those. Well, yeah. And mind that these were children, high school age kids I was talking to, but many of them started to understand my point. Are you really a libertarian? Do you really want the government out of your life? Do you really want them out of your finances like your friendly redneck liberal does? Well, no, because then that means you have to take care of yourself and your family yourself. And people don't want that.
Not surprisingly, people who are liberal on both kinds of issues, that's the bottom left quadrant, more fiscally liberal, more socially liberal, overwhelmingly voted Democratic, and consistent conservatives, the top right quadrant, were solid Trump voters. The socially liberal and fiscally conservative quadrant, that's that outlier that we've talked about, is mostly empty. And the opposite quadrant is the battleground of American politics.
So we're battling over the socially conservative and fiscally liberal. The folks I just described, that's who the politicians are fighting over.
That's where the majority of swing voters are at.
To make the difference in the 2024 election.
Right.
Unless we throw in a third-party candidate that pulls 10 to 12% of the vote in from disgruntled voters who don't want Trump or Biden if they end up being the candidates. And then they could make the difference.
So let's talk more about Scaffle voters and how that might play into a third-party candidate, and also what it tells us, I think, from a larger standpoint about the state of American politics today. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Scaffle voters. That's that group of voters that's more fiscally liberal and more socially conservative. And that is, folks, the majority of where swing voters lie. Now, yes, there are some swing voters in the more fiscally conservative, more socially liberal camp, but not even half as many as those in the other. Now, you might say, well, aren't there swing voters in the more socially liberal, more fiscally liberal camp, or the more fiscally conservative and more socially conservative camp? There are, but those are even less.
Those are your diehards.
Yeah.
Right? That's like we've always used the illustration of 40%. 40% are going to vote for the Republican candidate no matter what. 40% of Americans are going to vote for the Democratic candidates. Basically, they're fighting for 11% of the remaining 20%.
So the other thing I looked at, Lance, and this isn't talked about in the article, but I think it's an important observation about what it tells us too, is this notion, right? Let's look at the left-right divide between more fiscally liberal and more fiscally conservative. You will find quite a lot of dots along the very left edge of this chart over here. That's the more fiscally liberal side, right? So there's a good share, good healthy portion of the American voting public who would describe themselves as more fiscally liberal, both on the conservative and liberal side of things. But if we look at the more fiscally conservative side, there's almost nothing over here, not even close to the density on the other side. I mean, I'm talking about single dots here, folks, that I can count. Like along the edge, I count two dots on the more fiscally conservative side, at the farthest right fiscally conservative side. Now, if we compare that to the far left, mostly fiscally liberal side, there's so many dots overlapping that I can't even count it. And that includes red dots, by the way.
Right.
Right. Red dots being people that voted for Trump in 2016. There's a lot of red dots. There's not a single blue dot on the more fiscally conservative side. There's one red dot and one other party candidate voter dot. So what does it tell us? That as a majority of the nation, right, we'll find people that are on the very liberal side of economic policy, but we find almost nobody on the ultra conservative side of economic policy.
And we've talked about this before. Where are most of the dots on your chart that you like? They're right in the middle. Middle, right? Or are they diametrically opposed? Are they in the upper right and the lower left?
Here's the other thing that I think this tells us too. When you look at where the blue and red dots are concentrated, this is also very telling. The concentration, the largest concentration of blue dots is in the more socially liberal, more fiscally liberal camp. They're pretty healthily there. Yeah, there's blue dots scattered everywhere, but generally speaking, that's the strongest concentration. Now, if we look at the strongest concentration of red, this is where it's a little more interesting. It's in the more socially conservative, more fiscally conservative camp, maybe hedging slightly toward the line of fiscally liberal, socially conservative. So unlike being just simply diametrically opposed, lots of red dots in the more socially conservative, more fiscally conservative camp. So one of the reasons I bring this up is because this opinion piece by Bill Galston in the Wall Street Journal is titled "No Labels May Reelect Donald Trump." For those that don't know, No Labels is a group that's existed a long time. We've had them on this program a lot of times, and they advocate basically, I would sum it up as country over party, right? They're not saying that you have to forget that you're a Democrat or Republican, but that we have to be willing to work together, solve problems, compromise, which is why Lance and I have strongly supported that philosophy, not necessarily everything that they always do, but that philosophy that they claim to care about. And in this piece, Lance, he's basically claiming that there's a risk of reelecting Trump. The thing that I think is interesting, and we can dive into more of why he says that, is in some ways I'd contend that this chart says something different. It is possible that 2024 will be the year in which dissatisfaction with the two major parties will run so deep that the third force can break their grip on the electorate, but the odds are low. The structure of contemporary party competition makes unavoidable the question of which of the established parties an additional option would more negatively affect. Since 2000, we have been closely locked in a cycle of closely contested presidential elections in which no winning candidate has received more than 53% of the popular vote. Just a second for people for that to sink in. Since 2000, right? No winning candidate has received more than 53% of the popular vote.
Remember, 2000 was the hanging Chad in Florida.
Yes. In both 2016 and 2020, a shift of less than 1% in key states would have changed the outcome. And nearly every survey suggests that the 2024 race will be equally competitive. His next step then is to say, even a modest vote share for a third option could prove decisive. I agree with that. I agree with that statement. Although post-election surveys in 1992 showed that Perot drew equally from both parties, 2024 will almost certainly be different. According to Gallup, just over half of today's rank-and-file Democrats identify as liberal or very liberal, compared with nearly 3/4 of Republicans who call themselves conservative or very conservative. Therefore, Mr. Galston's next step is a center-seeking candidate would appeal more to Democrats than Republicans, and a winning Democratic coalition would include far more moderates, including moderate independents, than a Republican coalition. All the logic there makes sense. The fault is that we're relying on a Gallup poll where we asked voters if they identify as liberal or very liberal, or conservative or very conservative.
If I took part in the Gallup poll, I have to decide whether I'm liberal or conservative combined. Whereas the Scaffle voters,
it never asks you that.
It shows, but it divides you into your economic views and your
it distributes you based on policy, right, and beliefs.
Whereas the Gallup poll just said, do you describe yourself as
would you describe yourself as more liberal, somewhat liberal, more conservative, somewhat conservative?
So now you're making then the connection that the Gallup poll doesn't dive deep enough into the reality of the voters. Are you saying we could see a third party candidate be successful?
Well, the data
based on the Scaffle voting?
The contention by Mr. Galston is that there's a risk that you elect Trump because the age-old thinking, based on how voters self-identify, right, tells us that you would probably steal more people from the Democratic side of things than you would the Republican side of things, because they're more likely to be more moderate. Okay, but I think that the chart tells us something else. If we look at what's circled here, the Scaffle voters, those more socially conservative and more fiscally liberal voters, there are more red dots in that area than there are blue dots, which isn't surprising when you think about what it says, right? But what that tells us is if, and this is a huge if a third-party candidate was able to speak to that group of people, it would actually hurt Republicans more than it would hurt Democrats. And I think that's demonstrated by the fact that when have we really had, right, a candidate that was socially conservative and fiscally liberal who owned that spot? I would contend that, Trump tried to skirt that line, but he's definitely come in way far right on certain things. So has DeSantis. Biden certainly didn't come in that camp. If anything, he probably came in that camp more of a little bit more fiscally conservative and more socially liberal, which is actually where the least amount of voters are. So the other thing is that maybe they're more likely to cross party lines. But again, if you look at the density at the center of the chart, the intersection of these four quadrants, there are more red dots near that intersection, people that voted for Trump, than there are blue dots.
I'm going to leave you with this. That's very interesting, but it still then is going to, if there's a third party candidate, in your opinion, swing the vote in favor of one person or the other.
No, I think what you might see, I don't know if it'll be this presidential election or the next, but if dissatisfaction continues at the levels we've seen, I think the most likely outcome is that a third party will take enough votes that nobody gets 270. And we have awakening of people needing to know what the Constitution says.
The third party will actually win a state?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Or a couple of states, which will then force into the House of Representatives the decision.
See, there have been multiple, and I know we have to go to break, but I'll leave you with this. There have been multiple elections in my lifetime where I wanted to vote for a third party candidate and did not, because I was afraid the person I didn't really want
would get it because you voted for.
Because I didn't support.
Well, we talked about that a lot in 2016, right? I mean, I don't know how many conversations the three of us had about, the notion of we didn't really love any of the either of the two major candidates. We didn't love Trump. We didn't love Hillary. And I think there was a lot of people that felt similarly to that, or at least said they did, right? And the question was, well, then is it time to vote for a third party? And the struggle was that no, because the third party can't win, Well, what if the third party doesn't win but actually performs? And that, I think, is what's opened. That's, to me, the bigger question opened by the no labels ticket possibility. And that's what we'll talk about in the next segment. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. The reason a third party hasn't so far forced, or at least not in modern history, has forced the election to be decided by the House of Representatives is because they've never won a state, right? And we know that in a presidential election, it really doesn't matter how many votes you get. It matters how many electoral votes you get. The Electoral College is what counts. 270 to win. So what if nobody got 270? Well, it's happened. It has happened before. It's been a long time, but it has happened. And our Constitution says that then we got to go to the House of Representatives and that they will vote and they'll decide who the president is. And they also, by the way, folks, they can choose anybody. They don't have to, people forget that too, but they don't have to vote on the people that, I mean, the thinking is hopefully they're going to vote on the people from the election, but they don't have to do that. They, they can make Lance president if they wanted to.
And you don't get to vote your state.
Your state only gets one vote. Yes. Ross Perot didn't win any states. So yeah, he won some votes. Ross Perot won votes, but he didn't necessarily win any states. So the question becomes, and that's what we saw, right? Like in 2016 with Gary Johnson, right? The libertarian candidate. Some people were interested in that, but he didn't ever get enough votes in a state to win a state. So even though a few million people voted for the guy, he didn't actually get anything in terms of the competition for electoral votes.
When you spoke about Ronald Reagan, in 1980, when Reagan won, there was a third-party candidate named John Anderson who got like 6 to 8% of the vote.
Yeah.
And many people think that he took the votes away from President Jimmy Carter, which allowed Reagan to win.
And my point, I guess,
which is the way the third-party candidates typically are looked at in history.
Yes.
The most famous of which was Theodore Roosevelt splitting the Republican Party back in 1912 and allowing Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency with 42% of the vote.
Yep. So I think the thing here to take away from this is that those past history examples, they're informative of the current situation, but they're not predictive of the current situation. And the reason I think that's true is because what No Labels is looking to do with their ticket is a combination Republican Democrat that are known, right? So rather than taking a candidate who has never really been part of one of the major parties or is a fixed figure of a major party, they're pushing the two candidate thing and saying there's somebody at the top of the ticket, but the vice president's going to be, very important here, and we're gonna split those up. So if you targeted, here's the perfect storm scenario. If those two candidates were able to speak, a Republican and Democrat, to that group of more socially conservative, more fiscally liberal, now you have a ticket that maybe couldn't win everything, but there are definitely some states that I think that if you polled, you would find a majority of people in that state that feel that way. Now they win 2 or 3 states, and not 2 or 3 states with 1 or 2 electoral votes, 2 or 3 states where they take 8 or 15, electoral votes. Because you don't need a majority. You don't need a majority to take the state if there's 3 candidates.
Right. But you still have to get
the most votes. You only need a
votes.
plurality.
But you have to get the most votes.
Right. So the question is
there going to be a bad enough taste in everybody's mouth if it's a Trump-Biden rerun?
And then
to me, that's the question, right?
Right.
Is there going to be enough of a bad taste in everyone's mouth to cause them to go vote for a third-party candidate? I think the biggest outlier within the process, will we see a 1968 rerun of the Democratic nomination process, and will somebody challenge Biden? Because there are barely 50% of Democrats who want to see Biden run again. Not taken away from the No Labels, because I think that intrigues me, okay? Having a Republican and a Democrat running on the same ticket. We haven't done that
have we ever done that?
I don't.
We've had a Republican and Democrat president and vice president, but only because we had the system where the the person in second place gets vice president.
But that intrigues me. That's an enigma. And I would like to see that play out. But isn't it also in Mr. Galston's opinion piece? He says at the end that No Labels has said they will pull out if they think they're only going to get enough votes to switch the outcome. I thought he said that at the end of his...
The important thing...
No Labels isn't going to run a candidacy that they don't think they have a legitimate shot to win.
No Labels has scheduled a convention and is fighting to have ballot access in all states, which they're already making some headway on, but they haven't decided who the candidates are or if there will even be any candidates. You want to talk about the, craziness of the way the American political machine works. You can secure spots on ballots without candidates for those spots.
Your party can get a spot without naming who it's going to be.
Right. I mean, you have to name it at some point, but the whole point is that you don't have to have the person to secure the spot. So No Labels thinking is working with inside the existing system. What they want to do is something that nobody's done yet before, which is we're going to have a fail-safe position that basically says, and we have a convention scheduled. We don't know who's going to be at that convention, but we have a convention scheduled. We're ready to nominate some candidates. And we're going to have ballot access in all these states to put these candidates on the ballot. We will only do that if the American public is equally disinterested in the two major candidates as they have been in the past two elections.
We'll throw one more at you. My mind's just racing right now.
Yeah, I know. Lots of things.
What happens if, for some reason, former President Trump doesn't get the Republican nomination? Does he take his ball and go mount a third party candidacy?
If you'd asked that question in 2016, right? If Trump lost, because that was a big item of speculation during the Republican primaries. I mean, he didn't lose the primary.
But when he asked the question?
Yeah, he was asked the question and he refused to say that he would necessarily
support the Republican nominee if it wasn't him.
If it wasn't him. Now, do I think that if it hadn't been him, he actually would have? No, I don't think so, because I think it goes back to what we talked about, which is I'm not sure he necessarily thought he was going to win the nomination anyway. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure that it would have been, may he have made noise? Sure. Would there have been a book? Absolutely. There would have been plenty of stuff, but I'm not sure that he really would have gone to the hassle or money expense of that. Now that he's been president, right? Whole other ball of wax. Because what happens, looking back at our chart, to this deep committed red group when the guy they love isn't a Republican anymore?
Could Trump get 35% of the vote against the Democratic and Republican nominee and therefore win the election or throw it to the House? See, I have two things. I would love to see a Democrat run in the primary against Biden. I'd love to see No Labels put the candidate on. Give it to a Republican and then have Trump run a third-party candidate. Oh, we would have lots of material in the lead up for that election.
We would have lots of material. Well, because here's the thing, right?
Would it be a prelude to a civil war? Because that's what happened in 1860.
And we know how that went. It didn't go well.
They split the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Lincoln was the new face on the block. Only the second time the Republicans had run a presidential candidate. And then you had an outlier party, the Constitutional Union Party.
If Trump does that, right, he doesn't get the Republican nomination. Maybe, he just barely loses it, doesn't get the nomination. Runs outside of that election, because I think that if he runs, outside of the Republican Party, right, there's almost certain that he takes a few states. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's a core group that will vote.
Yeah, almost certain. I don't know which states offhand, but I mean, if you look at the states that historically vote red, right, you can probably peg a couple and say they're going with Trump regardless of what party he's with. That's just what's going to happen.
They probably exist between the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains.
Probably. So, but if you take a few of those states, that could be enough that you poach what the Republicans would have needed to win, and the regular Republican establishment wins a few of the swing states, which is what the coasts would have needed for their liberal ticket to win. So nobody gets it. It goes to Congress. But now, what does Congress do? I mean, what does Congress do with Trump, Republican establishment of some kind, and a Democratic candidate?
Do you go back to 1824 when Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, received the most electoral college votes, but not a majority, And the House picked John Quincy Adams to be president.
That's right. They said, hey, we have the power and we want him to be president.
Because we don't want Jackson.
That's right. So that's why.
So see, folks, things like this have happened.
All bets are off.
We're not making this stuff up. Stuff like this has happened in our history with our current system of electing people.
And then you got some people say, wait a minute, you mean that we've had a president who didn't get a majority of the popular vote and didn't get a majority of the Electoral College? Uh-huh. Yep. That's right. His name was John Quincy Adams.
Look it up, 1824.
Yep. And he's one of my favorite guys. He also did a lot to help bring about the end of slavery. So, that whole thing of, but if the people had had their way, Andrew Jackson would have been president.
Which they got 4 years later.
They got anyway, but, it wasn't long that it was subverted. Something about the Adams being bad about, not speaking their mind. Doing what they thought's right, regardless of the political consequences. Both John Adams and John Quincy Adams suffered that. And guess what? They only spent one term in office, too. Funny how that.
They're the only two out of the first 8 presidents to get one term.
Yep. Like father, like son.
Because they did what was right versus what was politically expedient.
But that's the point of anything can happen once it goes to the House. I mean, that was anybody's guess who's picked then. Because once it's gone to the House, they're not under any obligation to pick anybody that we like. I mean, you could say, well, yeah, they are, because if they don't, then we'll be upset. But, they're going to pick somebody that they want. Or maybe there's the other scenario that we've never played with. Like they got John Quincy Adams picked. Pick somebody that that you feel like's a safe bet. Now, maybe by all accounts, there was no Civil War. So, what if the House can't decide? Because we don't have a provision for that one.
No, they just keep voting until they do.
Well, that's what I mean. So what happens?
Like the election of 1800, I want to say it was like 30 different votes.
Right.
Or more than 30 votes in the House.
What does it do to our country if Inauguration Day comes and goes and the House still hasn't chosen somebody? I mean, who's in charge?
Stay tuned. We're going to talk about that, I'm sure, at some point.
Why do we have this show today, Lance? To scare people? Is that what?
No, I mean, this is, if you can't tell, we're excited. This is like our bread and butter stuff that we just love to talk about. But we talked about it today because we have a mission. And our mission at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we both agree that 2024 could be a very interesting election year. We haven't even got into yet what's going to happen in the House and the Senate in 2024. This could be a real game changer, folks. But if you like today's show and you tell your family and friends and they say, where can we find and listen to this show ourselves, tell them as a podcast, we're on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us releases new episodes as a podcast Tuesdays and Thursdays. Those same episodes can be heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the United States, parts of Canada. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.